The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Clara's cottage, casting delicate shadows across the silent grand piano that dominated her living room. At 62, Clara had grown accustomed to the quiet symphony of her solitary life, the gentle tick of the grandfather clock, the whisper of pages turning as she catalogued antique pieces, and the conspicuous absence of music from the beautiful instrument that had belonged to her grandmother. Clara ran her fingers along the piano's polished mahogany surface, as she did every morning, feeling the familiar pang of regret that had settled in her chest like a persistent ache. The keys were unresponsive, the internal mechanism long since seized by age and neglect. She had inherited the cottage and everything in it 3 years ago, along with the weight of conversations never had and melodies never heard. The piano sat like a beautiful corpse in her living room, its lid perpetually closed, its bench pushed neatly underneath. Clara had tried once to have it repaired, but the local piano technician had shaken his head sadly, explaining that the internal damage was too extensive, the parts too obsolete. It would cost more than buying a new piano, he'd said, and even then, there's no guarantee it would ever sound right. Her grandmother, Evelyn, had been a woman of few words about her past. Clara remembered her as gentle but secretive, always humming under her breath but never speaking of music or the life she'd lived before settling in this coastal town. The old woman had spent her final years in a nursing home, her mind clouded by dementia, taking whatever secrets she harbored to her grave. Now, surrounded by Evelyn's belongings, Clara felt more disconnected from her than ever. The cottage itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something. Built in the 1920s, it had weathered decades of coastal storms, its walls thick with memories and the faint scent of lavender that Clara could never quite locate. Every room held traces of her grandmother's presence, pressed flowers between book pages, hand-knitted doilies on every surface, and photographs that raised more questions than they answered. Clara had moved here after her divorce, seeking solitude and a fresh start. Her career as an antique restorer had always been solitary work, requiring patience and attention to detail that few people possessed. She specialized in furniture restoration, finding peace in the methodical process of bringing forgotten pieces back to life. There was something poetic about giving discarded objects a second chance, breathing new purpose into things others had given up on. The doorbell chimed, interrupting her morning ritual. Leo Martinez stood on her doorstep, his weathered face bright with enthusiasm despite the early hour. A retired history teacher with an infectious passion for the town's past, Leo had become Clara's closest friend since she'd moved to the cottage. His silver hair was perpetually disheveled, and his eyes held the bright curiosity of someone who had never stopped learning. "Clara, perfect timing," he said, stepping inside without invitation, as had become his habit. "I've been thinking about the Heritage Fair next week. You really should display some of your grandmother's pieces. The town would love to see them." Clara sighed, moving to the kitchen to pour him coffee. The kitchen was her favorite room, with its vintage fixtures and herb garden visible through the window. She'd spent countless hours here, drinking tea and wondering about the woman who had prepared meals at this same counter for 50 years. "I don't know, Leo. Most of her things are so personal. I wouldn't know what to choose." "That's exactly why they'd be perfect," Leo insisted, accepting the steaming mug. His hands were stained with ink from his constant note-taking, a habit that had persisted long after his retirement. History isn't just about famous people and grand events. It's about the everyday lives that shaped our community. He gestured toward the piano. "That beautiful instrument, for instance. I bet it has stories to tell." "It doesn't tell any stories," Clara said, perhaps more sharply than intended. "It's been silent for as long as I can remember." Leo's expression grew thoughtful, and he walked over to the piano, running his hand along its surface with reverent care. "You know, there are rumors about this cottage. Old-timers say your grandmother used to host musical gatherings here decades ago. Quite lively ones, from what I've heard." Clara frowned, joining him beside the piano. "That's impossible. Grandmother was always so quiet, so reserved. She never even mentioned music, let alone hosting parties." "People change," Leo said gently. Sometimes they have reasons for leaving parts of themselves behind. He paused, studying her face. Have you ever looked through all of her belongings? Really looked? Clara had to admit she hadn't. The task had seemed overwhelming, and she'd been content to live surrounded by her grandmother's possessions without examining them too closely. It felt like an invasion of privacy, even though Evelyn was gone. There's another thing, Leo continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I've been researching something for months now. There was a musical group that performed in this area back in the 70s and 80s. They were called the Twilight Ensemble, and they specialized in experimental compositions, music that was ahead of its time. What does it have to do with my grandmother? Maybe nothing, Leo said, but his eyes suggested otherwise. It's just that the group disappeared suddenly in 1978. No farewell performance, no explanation. They just stopped. And around that same time, your grandmother moved to this cottage and became the quiet woman you remember. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Leo, you're being ridiculous. My grandmother was a simple woman who liked her garden and her books. Was she? Leo asked quietly. Or was that just what she wanted people to think? That afternoon, Clara found herself in the cottage's dusty attic, motivated by Leo's words and her own growing curiosity. She'd been meaning to properly sort through her grandmother's belongings, but the task had felt overwhelming. Now, with the Heritage Fair approaching and Leo's mysterious hints echoing in her mind, she had a reason to face the past. The attic was cramped and sweltering, filled with the accumulated detritus of a long life. Boxes lined the walls, each one labeled in her grandmother's careful handwriting: winter clothes, books, kitchen items, photographs. Clara started with the photographs, hoping to find images that might contradict Leo's wild theories about her grandmother's secret musical past. The first box contained exactly what she expected: family pictures, vacation snapshots, and portraits of relatives she barely remembered. But as she dug deeper, the contents became more intriguing. She found professional quality photographs of musical performances, concert programs from venues she'd never heard of, and reviews clipped from newspapers with headlines like "Innovative Compositions Dazzle Audiences" and "Twilight Ensemble Pushes Musical Boundaries." Clara's hands trembled as she examined the photographs more closely. Many showed groups of people with musical instruments, and several featured a young woman who looked remarkably like her grandmother. But this woman was vibrant, confident, her hands poised over piano keys with obvious skill. The resemblance was unmistakable, but the personality radiating from the photographs was completely different from the reserved woman Clara remembered. One photograph stopped her cold. It showed a woman in an elegant evening gown, seated at a grand piano on a concert stage. The woman's face was turned toward the camera, her expression one of intense concentration and joy. Even accounting for the decades that had passed, Clara knew she was looking at her grandmother, but a version of her grandmother she had never seen or imagined. In the final box, Clara's fingers closed around something unexpected: a small, tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain. The locket was heavier than it appeared, its surface engraved with intricate musical notes that seemed to dance around its circumference. Inside was a miniature photograph of the same young woman, now clearly identifiable as her grandmother, standing center stage with a group of musicians. They were dressed in formal performance attire, and the backdrop suggested an elegant concert hall. Below the photograph, in tiny script, were the words, "Evelyn Morrison and the Twilight Ensemble, 1977. Clara stared at the image, trying to reconcile this confident performer with the quiet woman who had raised her father. Morrison, that was her grandmother's maiden name, the name she'd used before marriage. Clara had never heard it spoken aloud, never seen it written down. Her grandmother had been Evelyn Chin for as long as anyone could remember. As she continued searching, Clara found more evidence of her grandmother's mysterious past. There were letters from music critics, invitations to prestigious performance venues, and even a few royalty checks for compositions that had been performed by orchestras across the country. The amounts were substantial, enough to suggest that Evelyn Morrison had been more than just a local performer. But the most intriguing discovery was a leather-bound journal filled with musical notation. The handwriting was unmistakably her grandmother's, but the complexity of the compositions was staggering. These weren't simple melodies or folk songs. They were sophisticated, experimental pieces that seemed to predict musical developments that wouldn't become mainstream for decades. Clara spent the rest of the afternoon poring over the journal, trying to make sense of the musical notation. She had taken piano lessons as a child, but these compositions were far beyond her limited understanding. They seemed to blend classical structure with jazz influences, incorporating unusual time signatures and harmonies that felt both familiar and completely alien. One composition in particular caught her attention. It was titled Signature Melody and appeared to be a recurring theme throughout the journal. The notation was simpler than the other pieces, a sequence of 8 notes that seemed to form the foundation for many of the more complex compositions. Clara found herself humming the melody, surprised to discover that it sounded familiar, like something she'd heard before but couldn't quite place. The following days passed in a blur of preparation and growing unease. Clara selected a modest collection of her grandmother's belongings for the fair, some vintage lace, a few pieces of jewelry, and an ornate wooden chest that had always sat in the corner of the living room. She kept the locket and photograph to herself, unsure why she felt the need to guard these particular secrets. The wooden chest was indeed beautiful, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story. Clara had always assumed it was just decorative, but now she wondered if it, like everything else in her grandmother's life, held hidden depths. She ran her fingers over the carvings, noticing details she'd never seen before, tiny musical instruments hidden among the floral patterns, notes and clefs disguised as decorative elements. As the Heritage Fair approached, Clara found herself spending more time at the piano. She would sit on the bench and press the keys, hearing only the dull thud of hammers striking dead strings. But sometimes, when the afternoon light hit the instrument just right, she could almost imagine it whole again, filled with music and life. The Heritage Fair transformed the town square into a bustling marketplace of memories. Local families displayed treasures passed down through generations, while visitors wandered between booths, exclaiming over old photographs and antique curiosities. Clara's display attracted polite interest, but she found herself distracted, her mind returning repeatedly to the mysterious photographs and the woman in them who had somehow become a stranger. The atmosphere was festive, with local musicians providing entertainment throughout the day. Clara listened to their simple folk songs and popular covers, wondering what her grandmother's experimental compositions would have sounded like in comparison. Had they been too advanced for their time? Too challenging for audiences expecting familiar melodies? Midway through the afternoon, a distinguished man in an expensive suit approached her booth. He introduced himself as Dr. Hawthorne, a professional appraiser specializing in historical artifacts. His interest in the wooden chest was immediate and intense. "Mrs. Chun," he said, his eyes fixed on the chest, "this is a remarkable piece. Mid-19th century, I'd estimate. The craftsmanship is exceptional." He ran his hands over the intricate carvings, his excitement palpable. "I don't suppose you'd be interested in having it properly valued?" Clara watched as he examined the chest with intense focus, making notes in a leather-bound journal. His enthusiasm was infectious, and she found herself imagining the chest sale providing enough money to properly restore her grandmother's piano. "The workmanship is extraordinary," Dr. Hawthorne continued, pointing to various details. "See these carvings? They're not just decorative, they tell a story. This appears to be a narrative piece, possibly commissioned to commemorate a specific event or person." Clara looked more closely at the carvings, seeing them through his expert eyes. What she had taken for simple floral patterns were actually complex scenes, musicians performing, audiences listening, instruments being crafted. The chest itself was a celebration of music and artistry. "I'd be happy to examine it more thoroughly," Dr. Hawthorne said. "Perhaps we could arrange a private viewing at your home? I suspect this piece has significant historical value." As closing time approached, Leo appeared at Clara's booth, his face flushed with excitement and something that looked like barely contained anticipation. He'd been absent for most of the day, claiming he had research to complete for his own presentation. "Clara, I have a favor to ask," he said, his words tumbling over each other. "I've been researching something for months, and I think I've made a breakthrough. For the closing ceremony tomorrow, I'd like to present my findings to the community. But I need your grandmother's piano." Clara's heart sank. "Leo, you know it doesn't work. It would be embarrassing." "Trust me," he interrupted, his eyes bright with mysterious purpose. "I think you'll find it more interesting than you expect." "What are you talking about?" Leo glanced around, making sure they weren't overheard. "I've been investigating the Twilight Ensemble, the musical group I mentioned. I found old newspaper archives, concert programs, even some amateur recordings. Clara, your grandmother wasn't just a member of that group. She was their leader, their primary composer." Clara felt the world shift beneath her feet. "That's impossible." "I have proof," Leo said quietly. "Photographs, reviews, even some of her original compositions that were donated to the university music library. Evelyn Morrison was a musical genius, decades ahead of her time. But something happened in 1978 that made her disappear from the public eye entirely." "What happened?" "I'm not sure yet, but I think the answer might be connected to that piano of yours. Will you let me bring it to the ceremony tomorrow?" Against her better judgment, Clara agreed. That evening, she and Leo carefully transported the piano to the town square's small stage. The effort required several neighbors' help and a rented dolly, and Clara felt increasingly anxious about the attention the piano was drawing. "Leo, what exactly are you planning?" she asked as they positioned the instrument under the stage lights. "Tomorrow," he said with a smile that mixed excitement and conspiracy, "you'll understand everything." The next morning brought Dr. Hawthorne to Clara's cottage for the promised private examination. As he worked, Clara found herself drawn to the piano's vacant place in the living room, the space where it had sat for 3 years suddenly feeling empty and expectant. "Your grandmother had excellent taste," Dr. Hawthorne commented, examining various pieces throughout the house. "These aren't just antiques, they're carefully curated objects, each one chosen for its historical and artistic significance." He paused in front of the piano's empty space. "I noticed you moved the grand piano. Magnificent instrument. These grands from the 1920s are quite rare, especially ones in such good condition cosmetically." "It doesn't work anymore," Clara said sadly. "The mechanism is damaged beyond repair." "Ah, that's unfortunate. Though I have to say, these old pianos often had fascinating modifications. Wealthy families would sometimes have secret compartments built into them, places to hide valuables or important documents. The piano's large body made it perfect for such purposes." Clara's pulse quickened. "Secret compartments?" "Oh yes," Dr. Hawthorne said, his eyes lighting up with professional enthusiasm. "I've seen pianos with hidden drawers, false backs, even entire sections that could be removed to reveal storage space. The modifications were usually quite clever, designed to be invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for." After Dr. Hawthorne left, Clara found herself thinking about his comments. Had her grandmother's piano been modified? Was there more to the instrument than its beautiful but broken exterior suggested? She walked to the town square, where the piano sat on the stage like a patient performer waiting for its cue. The Heritage Fair's closing ceremony was scheduled for late afternoon, and already people were gathering, curious about Leo's mysterious presentation. Clara approached the piano cautiously, running her hands over its familiar surface. Now that she was looking for them, she could see subtle differences in the woodwork, joints that didn't quite align, panels that seemed slightly newer than the rest of the instrument. Had these always been there, or was she seeing patterns that didn't exist? The locket hung heavy around her neck, and she pulled it out, studying the musical notes engraved on its surface. The melody they represented was the same one from her grandmother's journal, the signature melody that had seemed so familiar. On impulse, Clara positioned herself at the piano bench and tried to play the sequence. The keys responded with the expected dull thuds, but as she pressed the 8th and final note, she heard something different, a faint click, deep within the piano's body, distinct from the usual mechanical sounds. Clara froze, her hands poised over the keys. Had she imagined it? She pressed the same sequence again. A, G, F, E, D, C, B, A. Another click, followed by what sounded like gears turning, metal sliding against metal. Her heart pounded as she realized she might have stumbled onto something extraordinary. The melody from the locket, the sequence her grandmother had written and rewritten throughout her journal, wasn't just a composition. It was a key. The Heritage Fair's closing ceremony drew the entire town to the square. Clara stood nervously beside the piano, the locket's weight a constant reminder of the questions that had been multiplying in her mind. Leo had been mysteriously absent all day, claiming he needed to make final preparations for his presentation. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the square, Leo finally appeared. He was carrying a box filled with documents and what appeared to be old audio equipment. His face was flushed with excitement and something that looked like anticipation mixed with anxiety. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Today we celebrate not just our town's recorded history, but the stories that have been hidden, waiting for the right moment to be discovered." Clara's breath caught as Leo began to unfold his research. He had newspaper clippings, photographs, and even scratchy audio recordings of the Twilight Ensemble's performances. As he spoke, Clara realized that her quiet grandmother had been something extraordinary, a composer whose work was decades ahead of its time, whose innovations had influenced musicians across the country. "But here's the most remarkable part," Leo continued, his eyes meeting Clara's. "Evelyn Morrison didn't just write music. She created what we might call musical puzzles, compositions that were also keys to unlock secrets. And I believe that this piano holds the greatest secret of all." The crowd murmured with interest, but Clara barely heard them. Her mind was reeling, trying to process everything Leo was revealing. Her grandmother hadn't been a simple, quiet woman. She had been a musical genius whose work had been forgotten by history. Leo approached Clara, his expression gentle but insistent. "Clara, I need you to trust me. Your grandmother left clues, breadcrumbs that led me to this moment. The locket you're wearing, it's not just jewelry. It's a key. And the melody engraved on its surface is the final piece of a puzzle that's been waiting 47 years to be solved." Clara's hands shook as she realized Leo knew about the locket, about the secret melody, about everything she'd been discovering. "How did you?" "Your grandmother and I corresponded for years before she died," Leo said quietly. "She was waiting for the right moment to reveal her secret, but her illness prevented her from sharing it directly. Instead, she left instructions, a trail of clues that would lead to this moment." He gestured to the piano. "This instrument isn't just broken, Clara. It's been waiting. Your grandmother built something extraordinary, something that required the right person at the right time to discover it." Clara felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders. "What do you want me to do?" "Play the signature melody," Leo said softly. "The one from the locket. Let your grandmother's music unlock what she's been hiding." Clara's fingers found the keys, and as she pressed the familiar sequence, the crowd fell silent. The clicks were audible now, amplified by the evening quiet. But this time, they were followed by a symphony of mechanical sounds, gears turning, springs releasing, metal sliding against metal with precision and purpose. Before Clara's amazed eyes, a panel in the piano's body swung open with a soft whoosh. Inside, where there should have been empty space, was a pristine, perfectly preserved musical mechanism, strings, hammers, and soundboard all in immaculate condition. But more remarkably, built into the secret compartment was a series of small drawers, each one filled with sheet music. The crowd gasped as Clara reached for the first bundle of compositions. The paper was cream-colored and rich, the musical notation written in a flowing hand that she recognized from her grandmother's shopping lists and birthday cards. At the top of the first page, in elegant script, were the words, "For the granddaughter who will understand the music I could never share." As Clara began to leaf through the compositions, she realized she was holding hundreds of pieces, symphonies, sonatas, chamber music, and songs unlike anything she had ever seen. The musical notation was conventional, but the compositions themselves were revolutionary, blending classical structure with innovative harmonies that seemed to predict musical developments that wouldn't become popular for decades. Tucked between the compositions was a letter written in her grandmother's familiar handwriting. Clara's voice trembled as she read it aloud to the fascinated crowd. "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then you have discovered what I could never find the courage to share during my lifetime. I was once a different person, bold, ambitious, unafraid to push boundaries. But the world wasn't ready for my music, and I wasn't strong enough to fight for it. The critics called my work too experimental, too challenging, too different. Concert halls refused to book us. Record companies turned us away. By 1978, I was exhausted from fighting for recognition that never came. I retreated into silence, but I never stopped creating. This piano became my vault, my secret sanctuary where I could continue to compose without fear of judgment or rejection. The music inside represents 30 years of hidden work, compositions I wrote in the hours when the world was sleeping and I was free to be myself. I built this mechanism so that my music would survive, waiting for someone who would value it not for its commercial potential, but for its artistic truth. I always hoped that someone would be you. You have your grandfather's gentle spirit, but I see in you the curiosity and courage that I lost. The lock was designed to respond to my signature melody, the theme that runs through all my compositions. I hummed it to you as a child, hoping that someday you would remember and understand. Music is not just sound, it is connection across time, love made audible, the soul's true language. Play these pieces, my dear one. Let them sing the songs I never had the courage to share. The world may be ready now for what it rejected then. And even if it isn't, at least my music will have found its way to someone who understands its value." Clara's tears fell onto the letter as she read, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. Around her, the crowd waited in respectful silence, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Leo handed her another document from the hidden compartment, a detailed journal explaining the construction of the piano's secret mechanism. "Your grandmother was not just a musician," he said quietly. "She was also an inventor, an engineer. She designed this entire system herself, working with a master craftsman to create something that would preserve her work for future generations." Clara stood slowly, her grandmother's letter still clutched in her hand. The secret compartment had revealed not just music, but a complete picture of a woman who had lived a double life, publicly quiet and reserved, privately passionate and creative. "I had no idea," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She never told me. I thought she didn't care about music." "She cared so much that she built a treasure vault to protect it," Leo replied. "She was waiting for the right person to discover it, someone who would understand not just the music, but the courage it took to create it." Clara looked down at the compositions in her hands, then at the piano that had stood silent in her living room for 3 years. All this time, she had been living with her grandmother's greatest secret, her most precious legacy. As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about the day's revelations, Clara remained seated at the piano. The hidden mechanism had been fully revealed now, and she could see the intricate system of gears, springs, and levers that had kept her grandmother's secret safe for decades. She placed her fingers on the keys and, guided by the sheet music before her, began to play her grandmother's signature melody. The hidden mechanism responded beautifully, producing rich, clear notes that seemed to carry decades of unexpressed emotion. The music filled the square, and people stopped to listen. It was hauntingly beautiful, simultaneously familiar and completely new, like a conversation between past and present, between grandmother and granddaughter, between silence and song. As the last notes faded, Clara felt a profound sense of completion. Her quiet life had been preparation for this moment. Her years of careful restoration work, her attention to detail, her respect for the stories hidden in old objects, all of it had led to this discovery. The piano would return to her living room, but it would never be silent again. Her grandmother's music would finally be heard, and the Twilight Ensemble would have its encore, performed by a granddaughter who had learned that sometimes the most important treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment, the right person, and the right melody to unlock them. Clara smiled, her fingers still resting on the keys, and began to play the next composition in the stack, a piece titled For Tomorrow's Music, written by a grandmother who had never stopped believing in the power of song to bridge any distance, even the one between the living and the dead.